Also available in this series to accompany the villages of Hampshire are the New Forest and a Southern Shore. For further details, please contact your local suppliers or telephone Agilis Pictures on 0703 44 0883. Hampshire is a county with an interesting past, a past that's been shaped by the rivers that flow through it, and each village along the river banks has its own story to tell. It was the rivers that brought many of Hampshire's early invaders deep down into the county. Some came to plunder, but others, on finding fertile soils by the river's ready supply of fresh water, settled for good. This ancient farm project at Butser demonstrates the way that people would have lived nearly 2,500 years ago, in social farming communities that may well have later developed into the villages we know today. The southern chalk downlands proved ideal for grazing sheep, an animal that provided both meat to eat and wool for clothing. Grazing sheep was to prove to be one of the most important factors in boosting Hampshire's early economy. The trade peaked in the Middle Ages, but downland sheep farming is still practiced today. The chalk downlands around the village of East Meon is a good example. On a quiet spring day, East Meon, named after the river that rises nearby and flows through its main street, has a timeless quality. The oldest building in a village is nearly always the church. All Saints replaced an earlier Saxon building which was built by Bishop Warkin, a cousin of William the Conqueror, who also supervised the building of Winchester Cathedral. A church was almost always sited at the centre of the village. Further development took place to the south, on the sunny side, and away from unconsecrated ground to the north. With All Saints' Church positioned tight against the base of Park Hill, formerly part of a deer park for the Bishops of Winchester, East Meon village could only develop southwards. One of the local pubs celebrates the great angler Isaac Walton, who spent much of his time here fishing for trout. A reminder of the ancient past. Sheep still graze the churchyard during summer in traditional chalk-down fashion. The river flows on west through the village of West Meon. Until the end of the last century, a yew tree stood at the village cross, under which St Wilfrid the Bishop is said to have preached to local people as far back as 681. A somewhat more recent resident was Thomas Lord, who spent the last years of his life farming here, and his memory is commemorated by a local pub. He was the founder of Lord's Cricket Ground in London, and his body lies in the local parish churchyard of St John the Evangelist. The church is built in napped flint, common to many churches in chalkland areas. The building itself only dates back to 1840 and is Gothic revival in style. Further down the valley, the river flows through the village of Warnford. Warnford Park was once at its centre, but through the ages the lords of the manor gradually pushed out the local people. Ironically, today even the local manor house has gone. All that remains is the Church of Our Lady, founded by St Wilfrid of York in 682 when he came to convert Jute settlers. It was later rebuilt by the Normans. Today it's most famous for masses of snowdrops that herald the spring. Behind the old church stands a 13th century ruin, which in its day was an impressive building. The village now lies outside of the park. It's said Charles II visited the George and Falcon on his way to France. The area is famous for its watercress beds. As the Meon flows southwards, it passes through Exton. Set in open farmland not far from Old Winchester Hill, it appears a perfect Hampshire village. In winter, the meadows flood here. Early farmers would have relied upon this yearly cycle to fertilize the land, but today flooding is more strictly controlled. Summer comes and the water crowfoot is in full bloom. At this time of the year, the river comes to life. Corhampton has been described as one of Hampshire's wondrous Saxon places, although the mill and the village houses do not immediately suggest an ancient past. The church, however, was built around 1035, its flint and thinly plastered walls simple Saxon in style. It stands upon a man-made mound that may have religious significance, predating Christianity. Said to be the oldest church in Hampshire, it's one of only a few that survived almost unaltered. It was the Jutish tribe, the Mianwara, that first named this place. The village of Meonstoke is just across the river from Corhampton, lying as it does on the eastern bank of the Meon. The river was probably much wider in Saxon times, since there is archaeological evidence that the Danes sailed their longboats up to Meonstoke, where they battled with the local farmers. Despite resistance, some managed to settle here, but there was always some friction with the locals across the river at Corhampton and Exton. The church at Meonstoke dates back to the 13th century. The river now runs directly south and passes by the villages of Droxford and Soberton. Soberton is the more southerly, and its hilltop church of St. Peter's is the pride of the village. Its tower dates back some 450 years and is recognised as one of the finest in Hampshire, swarming as it is with demons and gargoyles. Legend has it that the tower was built from the savings of a butler and a maid. The heads of a man and a woman, either side of a skull, high above the west door, are said to represent them. Isaac Walton described the stretch of river near Soberton as the best trout fishing water in the country. In old age, he spent much of his time to the north at Droxford, where he stayed at the parsonage with his daughter and son-in-law. The village sits to the west of the river. The old church of St Mary's and All Saints is Norman in origin, although the tower is a 15th century addition. Wickham dates from the Middle Ages. Its square is thought to be the second largest in the country. This is the birthplace of William of Wickham, who during the 14th century became Bishop of Winchester and founded Winchester College. A church may have stood here from the 7th century. The present church of St. Nicholas, built around 1120, stands on an ancient burial mound. In 1813, the American frigate Chesapeake was captured by the much smaller Shannon in Boston Harbour. Towed to Portsmouth, its timbers were later used in Wickham's mill of the same name. Lower down the River Meon, the village of Titchfield also has its mill. Throughout Hampshire's long history, water mills have played an important role in the economy of the area. Titchfield itself was once of considerable consequence, largely due to the church estates it held along the Solent coastline. Titchfield Abbey is now no more than a ruin, but the parish church of St. Peter's still stands. Possibly founded by St. Wilfrid on his 7th century mission, it's thought to be the oldest Christian building in Wessex. In the Middle Ages, Titchfield was the porthead of the Meon estuary. In the early 17th century, the river was sealed off, and Titchfield, quite literally, became a backwater. The River Hamble rises in the chalk close to Bishop's Waltham. This was once the seat of the bishops of Winchester, and Waltham means settlement in the forest. Both are long gone. There was a Saxon minster here from around 700. It was burned by the Danes. Bishop Henry de Blois, grandson of William the Conqueror, built the present church. He also began the building of the bishop's palace. Richard the Lionheart is said to have been entertained here after his coronation. The Hamble is just about navigable to Botley, essential at one time for Botley Mill, which boasted the largest water wheel in Hampshire. Botley's first mill was present in Saxon times. The writer William Cobbett lived and farmed here for more than a decade in the early 1800s. He said that Botley had everything in a village that he loved and nothing that he hated. He was most famous for his book Rural Rides, though ironically it was written after he'd left the countryside to live in London. By the time the river reaches Bursledon, it is tidal. Since the launch in 1338 of King Edward III's man of war, the St. George, Bursledon has been an important boat-building centre. In 1154, Bishop Henry de Blois allocated land for a church at what was then called Brixadonna. By 1230, St. Leonard's was completed, though there may have been a church here far earlier. In 1888, a mass grave was discovered, most probably the crew of a Danish longboat from a fleet defeated by King Alfred in 871. Hamble is the yachting centre of the area. For centuries it's seen raiders come and go. Saxon, Jutes, Danes, and more recently, if 1377 might be considered recent, the village was attacked by the French. This is a village with everything. Delightful houses and busy with old pubs. It also has a common and a green, as well as an old church. The only fragment remaining of a Benedictine priory founded in 1109. Hamble Green looks down over Hamble Common, which leads down through woodland to the water's edge. On the opposite bank, Warsash may be clearly seen. Warsash lies almost at the mouth of the river and is by tradition a boat building and fishing village. The stony soil around about has also made it an important strawberry growing area. It was from villages like this, dotted along the south coast, that more than 50 years ago Allied troops left for the D-Day landings. From a pier in front of the Rising Sun pub, some 3,000 British commandos and French troops left for the Normandy beaches. A memorial now marks the spot. A short distance inland from Portsmouth Harbour is Southwick House. It was from here in June 1944 that the D-Day landings were overseen during Operation Overlord. the village still has a close association with the naval base of HMS Dryad. Southwick village itself has a long history. There was a small Augustine priory here as early as 1150. At the dissolution of the monasteries, the property passed to John White. The estate has come through to the present day almost intact. Consequently,